Okay, that's probably a good chance for me to ask about the metamorphosis from Plessy v. Ferguson in the 1890s of separate but equal, and to Brown versus Board, and not separate but equal, to now, which is perhaps separate and unequal. Or how would you describe this last 100 years and how we got to where are we now?
This reminds me of a question I was asked by a young woman who was like 22 years old and looked like a model, and she was a television reporter and I was in a conference somewhere, and she said, "We have 45 seconds. Could you explain what's happened the last 50 years?"
Larry doesn't look like a model.
Yeah. Larry's not a model, but he's asked me an equally impossible question, but I'm going to answer it with a bunch of simple sound bites here. The Plessy versus Ferguson. How many people have ever read Plessy? You know, in 1896, the Supreme Court was asked whether or not segregation was a problem, whether it violated the 14th Amendment of the American Constitution, an equal protection of the laws provision. And they decided in that decision that it wasn't a problem, that separate could be equal, and that in any case, we couldn't change it because whites would not allow it to be changed, and that if there was a problem there, it was simply a problem in the minds of the black people. They didn't realize that they were being given equality, and they should stop fussing about it, and we should trust the local authorities to do the right thing. And of course, following that law, the local authorities and the state authorities all over the South enacted all kinds of overt segregation laws. People don't realize that the really intense structure of segregation didn't come until after the Supreme Court authorized it. And then states began to adopt all kinds of laws on disenfranchisement, of segregation of everything, from the hospitals to the libraries to the movie theaters to whatever they could think of segregating. They passed a law to segregate it. Basically, that when the court was asked very shortly after the Plessy decision, whether or not it was fair for a Georgia community to abolish high school altogether for black kids, whether that was equal enough. They decided unanimously that that was equal enough, that whatever the local people thought was the right thing to do was all right. So separate but equal was pretty much of a dead letter on the equality side from the beginning. The inequalities grew to be incredibly large, 500% and 600% inequalities in per student expenditure, different kinds of school years, different qualifications for teachers, almost everything you could imagine. When the NAACP was created very early at the beginning of the 20th century, they began a campaign to overturn separate but equal, or overturn Plessy. It seemed impossible because it had been adopted so intensely in 17 states, and it was being done in a de facto way in almost every other place. This, as the later court decisions would show when we investigated what had happened in cities all over the country. So they fought for a half century to create the evidence, to create the record, to begin to develop precedents about, and ultimately to pose the question to the Supreme Court in Brown whether separate could possibly be equal given the realities of American society and the history. And of course, in the Brown decision, the court says, among other things, that in the situation of legally imposed segregation, separate is inherently unequal. It can't be equal because the different social groups are themselves unequal in very profound ways, and you cannot create equality without crossing that line of breaking down the color line. Now the problem with the Brown decision, of course, is it creates this wonderful constitutional principle that is inherently unequal, and then it does almost nothing to implement it. The court says in the next year, Well, we can do something with deliberate speed as the local federal judges in the Deep South decide to do it.